So during this current coronavirus pandemic, there are several companies, biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies, that are racing to find some type of cure or vaccine. And so today I'm going to focus on one company in particular, Gilead Sciences. And this is a company I invested in today, and let me tell you why. Keep in mind that the investment strategy that I discussed in this video, specifically on this business, this company, it's based on my own research and it's my own opinion in what I'm investing in, and it should by no means be considered any type of advice. Definitely look into your own research, do your own due diligence for your own investments. So the company that I'm going to discuss today is Gilead Sciences. It is a biotech and pharmaceutical company based in California. And this company's focus is on antiviral treatments, medications for conditions like HIV or hepatitis. And most recently, most relevant to this topic today is the potential treatment for the novel coronavirus or COVID-19. In the news recently, there's been a lot of talk about a drug, a pharmaceutical known as Remdesivir, an antiviral, specifically for coronavirus. And it was this topic that prompted me to look into this company more and ultimately invest today. So before I go into the actual pharmaceutical, let's take a moment and do a little bit of cellular biology, molecular biology, just a little primer on it to go over what normally happens in the cell and how viruses like these affect the cell, and ultimately how a treatment like this can potentially help in the situation. Okay, so here we are on our digital whiteboard, and let's go over a little bit about the basic cell biology and where coronavirus fits into the picture. So first of all, coronavirus, the novel one, is actually one of a group of what we call RNA viruses, meaning that the virus has within it, here's a little picture. Oh, by the way, here's another disclaimer. I am an investor and I'm not an artist, so check this out. So what I have here is a RNA strand, which is the genetic material that is held within this virus. And this virus kind of looks like this. It's got a lot of proteins, particles or components rather, on the surface. So that's where the name corona comes from. It is a crown, corona meaning crown, and that's how it looks. It looks like a crown. So the group of viruses known as coronaviruses have this one strand of RNA, which is the genetic material, as I mentioned, and there have been a total of seven different coronaviruses that have caused illnesses in humans throughout history. So that's just an interesting fact. The specific body parts that are often involved are the respiratory, or your lungs, your breathing, and your GI or gastrointestinal tract. Those have been shown to be the most commonly affected. So let's go into the little bit of the cellular biology, and we can look at how this all kind of plays in together. Okay, so here is a very simple schematic. Again, I'm an investor, I'm not an artist. So this is a very simple schematic of what our normal lungs would look like. And if my anatomy professor were looking at this, he'd probably get a good chuckle out of this. Anyway, so you have your main bronchus, bronchi that branch off. When you breathe, air goes in here, and then it branches off into these tiny, small little sacs called alveoli that are very, very tiny, and they're on both sides here. I just drew it on one side. And what happens here as you breathe in oxygen here, then as your blood comes from your body, oxygen has been taken out of the blood in your body. It's come back to the lungs, And then what happens is that blood supply goes past these alveoli, oxygen goes from the alveoli to your deoxygenated blood, and it oxygenates them so that you have now newly oxygenated blood that goes to your body again, and it comes back in a cycle like that. So that's how you supply oxygen, much needed oxygen, to your body. So the point of this is that these alveoli, when you break it down to the smallest microscopic level, all the way down to a molecular level, just like every other organ that we have, these alveoli, the lungs themselves, the most basic form are found in our cells. So now let's go over what a basic cell looks like and what happens in a cell. Okay, so let me go ahead and draw a cell here. And in the cell you have what we call a nucleus. And then here is called the cytoplasm. I just wrote cyto. And what you have in the nucleus of each cell, remember, this is like your organs, your lungs, that are broken down to the most basic component. In the cell, you have the nucleus, that within the nucleus you have what is known as your DNA. DNA, you may have all heard of, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic material. And what that DNA looks like, it's kind of looks like this. It's a double helix, double-stranded. What happens is that in normal cell biology is your DNA, in order to keep the cells running, in order to keep the whole organ running, is that the cells have to constantly replenish themselves and build new products in the form of proteins. So what happens is this DNA is what happens is the DNA opens up, and the double helix, we call it, opens up, and the genetic material gets transcribed to a single strand out here in the cytoplasm, and these little lines here represent the nucleotides, we call them, which is the actual genetic material, and that is called your RNA. In this case, specifically messenger RNA. So this process here is called transcription. And then the third event that happens is the machinery out here, looks like this, kind of takes the messenger RNA and through a series of steps creates strands of what is known as our proteins, which are made up of amino acids. And it's these proteins that perform various tasks for the cells. They're the proteins that help muscles contract, helps oxygen containment within red blood cells in the form of hemoglobin proteins. So there are many different ways to have a positive effect on the cell structures and the cell function by creating these proteins. So this is a normal process of genetic material being transcribed to RNA, and then in this process right here, that's called translation. The genetic material is translated to amino acid based proteins. So the reason why this is important is that when a virus comes along, different viruses have different mechanisms. The current thinking of the coronavirus, again, it's this virus with a crown here that has its RNA strand in here. Now you can see what happens here is that the thinking is that this virus will come along to a normal cell like your lung cell and will attach to the surface because of its own proteins on the surface, attach here, get embedded into the cell, and then you have this, and it deposits this viral RNA here, viral. What it does then is it essentially hijacks the cell. It takes its RNA, and instead of your normal RNA, it uses the machinery of the cell and creates its own proteins to ultimately create new virus particles, new viruses. And the ultimate event is when the mechanism, the machinery in the cell is overtaken. The cell becomes so worn out, basically, that the cell itself dies, and then you have a bunch of new virus particles. So this is how this particular virus is considered, how its mechanism is. Now, the entire mechanism is still unknown at this point, but this is what has been determined so far through testing. So what does it ultimately lead to? It causes things like in the lungs, for example, it causes a lot of inflammation in the lungs. Inflammation. We talked about the alveoli, and if you have cells dying in the alveoli, then you don't have the appropriate function of the lungs anymore. You have a lot of inflammation. You have fluid buildup in the lungs, and oxygen not getting to the body, which is why it's so important for people to get respiratory support if needed, like a ventilator, for example. You can have something called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. That is the whole syndrome that I just described, and then ultimately, like we mentioned, the oxygen level in the body decreases because of all that. So it is a very significant process, and you can see how the RNA virus has its effect on normal cell function. So how this is relevant to this topic and with Gilead Sciences is the medication known as Remdesivir. Remdesivir. So the mechanism of Remdesivir being an antiviral is right here, right in this area, where the virus is trying to use the cell's machinery to create its own proteins. So the idea is that Remdesivir, through its mechanism of action, will basically block right here, block this step, so that the proteins, the viral proteins, are not completed. So that's the whole idea between Remdesivir. So now let me go over some of the research that's out there right now, which ultimately helped me decide when it came to investing in this company. Okay, so there are two very interesting articles that have come out recently regarding Remdesivir and treatment for coronavirus, COVID-19 specifically. So this is the first one in Cell Research from Wang et al. And this was published in on February 4th, so just last month. Remdesivir and chloroquine, so they looked at two different treatments options, two different drugs. Remdesivir and chloroquine effectively inhibit the recently emerged novel coronavirus or COVID-19 in vitro. So what that says is that they took a sample of the virus and they treated it in the lab using test tubes, using petri dishes, and they showed that there was an effect, there was a positive effect on it using these two treatments. But this was in vitro. That's what that means. It's done in a lab. This has not been, in this study, had not been done with real life patients being treated for the real life condition. But what's interesting to say as I scroll down the article, our findings reveal that Remdesivir and chloroquine are highly effective in the control of COVID-19 in vitro, again, in the lab. Since these compounds have been used in human patients with a safety track record and shown to be effective against various ailments, we suggest that they should be assessed in human patients suffering from the novel coronavirus disease. So they are referring to the fact that these treatments were previously used for SARS in 2002, as well as MERS in 2012, and they've also, and specifically Remdesivir has also been shown to decrease the virus production in vitro, again in the lab, against Ebola. But just like in this testing, that was only successful in vitro, And what's key is that remdesivir was not shown to be successful in actual patients with Ebola virus. So, but they did mention here that these compounds have been used in human with a safety track record. So what that means is that remdesivir, specifically in this discussion, has passed all of the safety tests that are usually used when it comes to evaluating the safety of the drug before it can go on to clinical trials. And the second very interesting article was this one, was published on March 5th, that was this month, and this was the first case of 2019 novel coronavirus in the United States. So this was regarding a case of a young man who was in Washington State, and he presented with a 4-day history of cough and fevers. So the article by Holshu et al., and of note, this was in the New England Journal of Medicine, so very high-level article and periodical. So what it showed in this report, it was a case report, and it showed how they did multiple tests, they multiple chest x-rays, and essentially the patient was getting worse as the hospital stay progressed. And let me go down to the point here. For example, right here, a second chest radiograph from the night of hospital day 4 or his illness day 9 showed evidence of pneumonia in the lower lobe of the left lung. So these radiographic findings coincided with a change in respiratory status. So he was requiring oxygen because his oxygen saturation levels decreased, dropped to as low as 90% while he was breathing ambient air. So basically this is saying that the person was declining rapidly while he was admitted there. And then here's the part here. On hospital day 6 or his illness day 10, they started to see worsening of his findings on the x-ray. And again, they decided to administer oxygen supplementation there. And here's the key point here, that treatment with IV remdesivir, again, a prodrug in development. So that's key, is that this was not even in a clinical trial yet. This was being used in what is known as a compassionate use, use to utilize the medication, even though it does not have the FDA approval to use it. But it was used because it was felt that the patient really needed it. So the key here is that this was given on the evening of day 7 with no adverse events observed in association with the infusion. And then look on hospital day 8, the patient's clinical condition improved, supplemental oxygen was discontinued. His oxygen saturation values, which is where they put a monitor on his finger, for example, and see how much oxygen is making it all the way to his finger, improved to 94 to 96% while he was breathing normal room air. He was not even on any supplemental oxygen or let alone any type of respirator. And the previous bilateral lower lobe rales were no longer present. Rales are findings that you have on physical exam as you're listening to the lungs, kind of like sound of crackles. His appetite improved, and he was asymptomatic aside from some dry cough and some rhinorrhea or some nasal drainage. And he was afebrile, and his symptoms eventually resolved, except for this cough, which was decreasing in severity. So what you have here is you have this case study of this treatment, and that was given to a patient that was rapidly declining and all of a sudden had a turnaround. So it's when I read these two articles that it really got my attention with this medication, and even though it is experimental at this time. So these are the key points then from what I just reviewed here. These are the key points of remdesivir and Gilead Sciences. Number one, that remdesivir has gone through a lot of the safety testing that normally would be done with medications like these. So it's had a history already. It's been used on other viruses, attempted both in the lab as well as human subjects, even though it did not have a benefit in Ebola. The fact is that the drug has been safety tested already past that. So compared to other companies that are trying to create a treatment, this medication and this company has a head start because it already has that safety testing already done. The second key point is that it has shown by clinical studies that it does work against this specific COVID-19 virus. It has been shown to work in the lab, and then you have this empiric data of the trial with this one patient in Washington that was accepted in the New England Journal of Medicine. So to me, that's my opinion, that is quite good evidence already, and that the clinical trials, the randomized clinical trials are in process now, and it should take about another month or so before we get data on that they've started in China. So to me, that's already some good data to start off, especially if I'm looking at this treatment and this company as an investment. You also have the fact that the FDA authorized this medication for compassionate use, and that's a big step because when you have a federal agency like that going to that measure to authorize the use of a medication, even though it hasn't been officially designated for a certain condition, you know that there is that push, there is that need to get this done in order to start helping patients. Orphan drug designation, which gives the company itself the government benefits that are involved in development of these types of treatments. Now, what's interesting, in the last few days, Gilead Sciences got a lot of negative press about that there was some concern that this was in a way allowing the company to have an unfair advantage over the treatment, and that this is profiteering, and there's a lot of that negativity. So what's really interesting is how the company has responded by rescinding or withdrawing their application for that orphan drug status. And what that tells me is that the benefits that they would have had from that designation, which allows them to have exclusivity with distribution for 7 years, for example, that instead of taking that short-term benefit, the company has decided, in order to eliminate any idea that they are taking advantage of the situation or profiteering in a way that's aside from what normal market conditions would allow, that they wanted to keep their reputation intact, keep the integrity intact in order to have a longer lasting positive effect. So for me as an investor, that made me even more interested in this company, because I know that they're in for the long run, and as an investor I want to stay with a company for a long time, especially if they're doing a lot of good research and coming up with excellent treatments. Okay, so that's my take on Gilead Sciences and the experimental treatment Remdesivir, and why I went ahead and invested in that today. So if you like this content, definitely subscribe for future videos like this, and I will see you on the next one.